Welcome to the New York Information Security Meetup / the Cyber Guild. I have the great pleasure to introduce Allan Alford, who's the CISO of NTT Data Services, and is a good friend. We've met a couple of times in the past, and we're just going to have a casual conversation about some topics we picked in advance, but we'll see where this conversation goes. So, Allan, how are you?
Good. How about yourself?
Good, good. So first and foremost, I recall that you have an amazing collection of video games.
I do. In fact, I'm a rabid gamer, retro gamer.
So
I've got a room in my house dedicated to the retro video game collection, much to my wife's chagrin.
So, which one is, from all the ones you have, and you can probably name a few, which one is your favorite? You have a soft spot for?
Absolute favorite game or favorite console?
Console. Let's console and game.
I'm going to go with Sega Genesis for the favorite console. And I'm a big fan of RPGs, so I'm going to go with Shining Force 2 on the Sega Genesis as my all-time favorite game.
So how did it start? Like, I'm assuming that you had one. And then you start collecting. Do you have anything missing from your collection? Anything that you try to get and it wasn't available?
At this point in time, I literally have everything I've ever hunted, anything I was ever looking for. I've got one of every single Sega console, one of every single Nintendo console, one of every single Atari console, one of every single Sony console, Microsoft, you name it, got them all. Anytime there's a title I want, I usually just go find it. But honestly, I have so many at this point, I'm just not looking for anymore. So it's a robust collection.
So do people that know you, get you for holidays and birthdays, they know that you're collecting, and so they try to maybe. Is that how it works?
It's been some of that, but honestly, at this point, I've got everyone trained on don't bother, because the odds are I've already got what you want to get me.
So what's the rarest item in your collection?
Let's see. Super Nintendo Earthbound in the original box with the original manual.
Wow. What would that run you like on eBay?
Probably $300 to $500, probably.
Wow, that's incredible. Hey, so you're a very accomplished CISO. You've published articles and papers and so on. How did you get to where you are today? Maybe you can walk us through like the career path. And how you started.
So I get asked a lot by people, like, how did you do it? What's the trick? What's the secret to success? And the reality is I have no clue whatsoever. I started years and years ago as just an IT guy. I was a sysadmin. I did Windows and I did Unix and I did Linux, and eventually they made me an IT manager and kind of climbed through the ranks there. And I started focusing on security back in the day when there weren't too many dedicated security roles at all. So every time a new project came up, like I was a firewall guy at one point, and then I was the guy in charge of the anti-spam solution at one point, and I was the one who implemented the password policy at one point. It kind of I picked up security projects where they came and went. And eventually left the IT career to join engineering because of that security focus. I was working at a company that made video conferencing products, and I was in charge of deploying those products in-house, as well as all the other IT functions I had. That was one of my functions, was deploying those products in-house. And I kept going to the engineers upstairs and telling them, I'm not happy with this. I want more security. And they would, well, what do you mean? And I would walk them through, don't do this protocol, do that protocol, don't do this port, do that port, have this be your default, give me this feature. And finally, one day I'm in my office and three of the guys from engineering come downstairs, and they knock on my door, open the door, walk in and shut the door behind them. And my first thought was, one criticism too many. I'm about to get the riot act read to me here, right? And instead, it was a very interesting situation. They said, why don't you come join us? Instead of sitting on the sidelines telling us what we're doing wrong after the fact, why don't you come help us make it secure in the first place? And thus kicked off my product security career. I did that for another 10 years. And the CIO came and tapped me on the shoulder one day and said, hey, you're the product security guy. You built the whole security program. Everyone says you've done a great job with it. Okay, all right, thank you. You used to be in IT, didn't you? And I was like, yeah. He's like, why don't you come be my CISO and bring the product security program with you, and you can do all of the security for the company. So that's kind of how it all started. I didn't even, I wasn't looking for it. I had no intention of becoming a CISO ever. And I've now been one 4 times now. So
Yeah, that's an incredible story. And so how did you go about, like, basically seeing what's out there, if somebody gave you the task of making things more secure, you know, what did you do? What were first things you took, like steps
yeah,
you
so
took to look at this stuff?
in the early days, it was all just Google and calling all my other IT buddies from other shops. Hey, have you guys ever done anything for this? Yeah. We got this anti-spam thing. What's your anti-spam thing called? Okay, I'll write that. And, I'll go talk to those guys. And then I would get on Google. Who competes with vendor name? And find 2 or 3 others and start calling them all and asking them questions. And I was talking to some folks earlier this week that this has kind of always been my approach, that I will, let's say I'm like back when I was evaluating MSSPs and MDRs, I started with, I know I need somebody who does this. I've never worked with someone who does this before. I know they exist. I'll meet the first one and ask them a ton of questions, and I'll get answers to those questions. And then I'll meet the next guy and ask him the same questions. And I'll meet the next guy and ask her the same questions. And the next one and ask them the same questions. And at some point, it occurs to me to ask other questions. And I would literally make a spreadsheet. And I would go all the way back to the first vendor if I had a new question. And I would ask that same question back across the whole spreadsheet of all the vendors until I eventually had this massive matrix developed. And the more I asked questions, the more questions it occurred to me to ask. And I just got better and better at grilling and refining my approach. And I always saved these spreadsheets for everything I did. And eventually it just kind of grew into a technique that I don't even really need the spreadsheets anymore. I just intrinsically sort of grill these guys now. Whatever thing I'm looking for, if it's a new firewall, if it's a new antivirus, if it's a new, CASB, DLP, whatever it might be, I just track and bombard these questions and just grill them until I'm happy with the answers and I hear confident answers coming back.
So that's fascinating. What type of questions do you typically, what would you say at the top, 3 questions that anybody should answer, should ask for the vendors?
Yeah, it depends on the particular thing. Let's say we're talking about a piece of technology like a DLP or a CASB or an antivirus or firewall, some tangible piece of tech. You want to know what their false positive rates are and whether they track those. You want to know what their true positive rates are and if they track those. You want to know what your escalation path is into that company if something goes south, right? Like I'm using your tool and I get it all set up and your professional services guys go home and now I'm running it and it's on me and it's my responsibility and something bad happens. What does escalation look like? Who do I talk to? How quickly can I get a hold of someone? Does that cost me extra? If so, how much extra? Is that bundled in? Is there a way to pay for that in advance? Have all of those conversations too. So, and then obviously unique to the specific thing. If it's DLP, you want to really get into the details of what DLP is and does and ask each vendor the exact same set of questions that you craft. But I'm a big believer in, everything they hand us is something that we own and we're stuck with. But they still need to be there in some capacity. And I want to know what that capacity is up front, because when the bad thing hits, that is not the time to be pulling out the rule book, pulling out the phone book, pulling out the whatever book, and trying to figure out who they are and where they are and how to get in touch with them and what they can or might do for you at this point, or whether they're going to suddenly bill you. That's all the stuff you should know in advance. Assume something is going to go wrong no matter what you buy, and have that plan in place for when that thing goes wrong.
Now, when you ask these questions, right? So I'm assuming not all the time you get the answers you're looking for. And then, how vendors are. Sometimes they, they're trying to spin the answer thinking, okay, this is what this guy is looking for. How do you, kind of sift through that noise and try to figure out, okay, what's the underlying, the answer that they really are, looking to,
I had a vendor in my shop just a few months ago, came and pitched to me. And one of my biggest rules is anytime any vendor says 100% or 0%, they're lying, right? Period. If they say it, they're lying. If they claim to do 100% of the things they're supposed to and 0% of the things they're not, right? I had a vendor that did the 100% claim, and he said it once and I let it go. He said it again and I challenged it. He adamantly insisted that his product really did do 100%. And so I let him finish his presentation. And I said, okay, so this works 100% of the time. He said, yes, so that will be in the contract, right? Uh-oh. Dead silence. Let them spin whatever they want. Let them say whatever they want. If they're going to make you a verbal commitment or promise during the dialogue, insist that be put in the contract. It's amazing how quickly they'll give you a more accurate answer when you insist that it get put in the contract.
So bringing up the vendor and vendor relationship, you are very big on security innovation through vendor relationships, right? Um,
Absolutely.
and so maybe we can kind of touch upon that, and then there's I find specifically there's a bit of a contentious relationship between enterprise and vendors, and I'm not really I can't really pinpoint what that is. Maybe we can kind of have an open discussion about this.
Sure, sure. So I was a traditional CISO a couple of times, and then I took a job as a CISO at a security firm, a company that made security products. So suddenly I'm a vendor. I'm a CISO, but I'm also a vendor.
So you moved to the dark side, right, Allan?
Yes, I did. But I was still also their actual CISO. Like, it was complicated. Right. I had a day job of securing the place, and then a night job of running around doing sales and marketing and enabling sales and marketing. So I learned something being in that shop that I didn't even know I was learning something. It wasn't until it went away that I realized I was missing something now. But being part of the security industry, I had all the latest industry news in my back pocket at all times, just from a casual chat in the hallway, just from somebody mentioning something briefly in a meeting. Marketing said something, sales said something, somebody in IT said something. I always knew what was going on in the industry. I knew everything. Like what company acquired what company just IPO'd, who came out with a new product, whose product was now being marketed and aimed to take out the other guy's product. Like, all of that level of news. I knew, even if they weren't direct competitors of ours, I still knew this stuff because you need to know the security landscape as a security vendor, right? Well, I left that company and I went back to being a regular old-fashioned CISO, at a non-security company. And all of a sudden I realized I no longer had any of that back pocket information. Like, all that info I used to get for free, I was no longer getting. And at the same time, I was, as any CISO is, to your point about contention, swatting back nonstop unsolicited cold calls, unsolicited emails, unsolicited LinkedIn approaches, unsolicited, you name it, just vendors constantly coming at you. And this is, to be a CISO is to have vendors constantly coming at you. There's no getting away from it. And so I realized one day, instead of spending all this effort swatting these guys back, what if collectively their knowledge is in fact the knowledge I used to have when I worked at a security company? In other words, these guys all have that same back pocket information I used to have. So what if I start actually talking to them consciously and on purpose and schedule it so it's a relatively small amount of my time, but I spend a couple of hours a week meeting with the various vendors. If somebody pops up on my radar and has some unsolicited something or another, maybe I should listen to them, right? Maybe they're going to teach me something I don't know. I'm probably not going to buy their product, but what if I learn about a new kind of product that's out there because I had a conversation? Or what if I learn that all these traditional solutions that have always existed, that this one new company now has this new thing they're doing that nobody else is doing. Like the very first vendor to have combined ML or AI with SIM, right? The first UEBA. Somebody came out with that. Some vendor was there to tell you about their UEBA back before anybody even knew what a UEBA was. Same thing with DLP when it first came out. Same thing with CASB when it first came out. Same thing with next gen firewall when it first came out. EDR, MDR, et cetera, et cetera. So that's not to say that I respond to the unsolicited calls still today. But what I do is I steer people towards my LinkedIn account. If I get an unsolicited email or phone call in my work environment, I consider that to be sort of intrusive, right? Like, that's my workspace and time. Stay away from that. But on LinkedIn, if you want to hit me up and say, hey, I'm a vendor and I make this new product that does X, and we think you should go with our product because we're, because of reason Y, and, give me a holler if you're interested, and if not, I'll leave you alone. I literally once a year post on LinkedIn this exact formula of how to pitch to me. And vendors do it. They pitch to me. And I'll get a quick, minute-long pitch. And if I like it, I'll call them back and say, yeah, let's set up a meeting. And so I spend a couple of hours a week meeting with vendors, learning about new technologies, learning about new solutions, grilling them about the industry, grilling them about their competitors. And I'm systematically, by way of my relationship with the vendor community, regaining that lost knowledge back when I used to be on the other side of the fence. And I found it to be invaluable.
It's amazing. And I think that something that every CISO should have is the rules of engagement, right? Where here's how because you obviously, as you mentioned, you get solicited like so many times a day, but if they do it the right way, you're going to be more open to having that discussion, right?
Exactly.
And I always said that the vendors are typically in the forefront of security innovation, right? They have to be. They do that for a living. So fast forward to what you do today. What do you do at NTT Data? And maybe like you can kind of share with us, what your you kind of did already. Like, what's your day-to-day look like? and maybe what you like and what you don't like about it.
Okay, so I'm the delivery CISO at NTT Data Services. We actually, as a data services company, we have 3 CISOs. We take security rather seriously. We've got the enterprise CISO, who's kind of what you would think of as a traditional global CISO role, I think is probably the best descriptor. He's our overarching visionary, runs the architecture team, is also the interface to the entire rest of the NTT empire, which if you combine all the NTT companies, I've seen different figures. I've heard 16th and 29th and 55th largest company on the planet. Wow. If you combine all of NTT. I'm with NTT Data Services, which is owned by NTT Data, which is owned by NTT Inc., et cetera. But he's the interface into the entire rest of the NTT empire, all the other entities that have their CISOs. Like we've got a whole CISO council, and he's kind of the one who drives those relationships. He drives the relationships with the headquarters. He provides sort of the global vision, and he runs the architecture teams. And then we have our corporate CISO, Dan, who is what you think of as just a traditional CISO. He's the CISO that, the notebook computer I'm working on is secured by his team. The servers are secured by his team, firewalls, That's Dan's team. And then I'm the delivery CISO. We are, as a company, providers of IT services to other companies. And so every one of those client estates, depending on the degree to which we're involved in their IT, I'm basically the one in charge of governing the security for those estates. And so, our services could range from, I'm trying to think of some good examples. BPO is one thing we do, which is business process outsourcing, which is something like, it's not even IT at all. Picture a group of people whose day job is filing insurance claims and data entry into the insurance system and assessing the claims and deciding who doesn't, get whatever qualifying, whatever. We might outsource that kind of business function where there's no IT at all. Sometimes we might be just the help desk. Sometimes we might be their entire IT shop. Sometimes we might be just their servers. Sometimes we might be just their cloud. So there's myriad possibilities. And I'm essentially the one driving the governance for all the security we do in all those environments. And so I'm busy.
Do you find there is an uptick of specific security project due to COVID-19 with the remote workforce, and the kind of rapid adoption of digital?
Yeah. So we as a company were ready for COVID. We were already set up to work from anywhere as kind of one of our paradigms. We were good to go. We flipped over the entire company in probably 3 or 4 days total. And we're a massive global company. We had everybody working from home successfully, literally 3 or 4 days, done. Our clients, though, again, I offer different degrees of services to different clients. And so, and there's thousands of clients. And so at the end of the day, it's the full spectrum. I saw everything. I saw companies that were equally ready, maybe even more ready. I saw companies that had no work from home plans whatsoever and had to suddenly adjust overnight. I saw everything in between, and lots of responses and lots of work. So for the next probably 6 or 8 weeks, I worked some really intense hours, but we got everybody there. Everyone that we were able to assist and help, and that we had a hand in shaping their COVID response, we offered that hand and we helped shape it, and we got everybody converted over. And I've got nothing but success stories now.
Yeah, so maybe if you don't mind, you can share with us, maybe without providing the intricate details, of course, and revealing the actual customer, maybe like an interesting project you were working on, and maybe some of the challenges that were associated with that particular project, and then the outcome and
yeah, I'm trying to think of what I can share. I'm always very cautious about sharing anybody's security posture.
Of course.
I guess I can speak in general trends, and not only
exactly.
that, I'm going to broaden the scope a little bit too, and say this isn't just a client conversation I'm having. This is also, I'm in multiple CISO communities with hundreds of other CISOs, and so I'm constantly collecting stories, be they from my own client environments, be they from others, because I also know other services folks and they have their clients, and I also know other CISOs that are just traditional CISOs. I mean, literally hundreds of them. So let's take that whole roll up of all of those stories and throw them on the table and say, let's sift through and look for a few trends. There were folks who had VPN capability and had their VPN concentrators and had their bandwidth, and were all set up for that for a portion of their workforce. And all of a sudden overnight, it was their entire workforce, right? And so bandwidth saturation became an issue. Yes, we can enable everybody, but suddenly everyone's connection is crawling and slow, and we're having struggles with that. Sometimes I saw people, and this was actually talking to quite a few other CISOs, a lot of people had to enable split tunneling, which they hadn't done before.
Mhm.
To try to alleviate some bandwidth concerns. A lot of people were ordering new bandwidth. A lot of people were ordering new VPN concentrators. Those kinds of stories. The same thing happened in the VDI space. Lots of people having to buy more gear, buy more bandwidth, get more things set up, get more applications embedded in their VDI solution. I saw a lot of work there. And I think all of that was because at the end of the day, not too many folks on the planet assumed 100% work from home. Everybody had a ratio. Everyone was operating on a ratio. At any given
Correct.
point in time, X% of my workforce is working from home. And so I think the whole world, to a certain extent, was caught by surprise. And I think bandwidth, concentrators, VDI or VPN, that point of concentration, I think those were the three areas that suddenly folks had to do some spending they hadn't planned on. And I think that was probably the biggest trends that we saw.
So that's interesting. You talk about spending. Due to the constraints now of the economic contraction and so on, do you find that there's additional scrutiny over budgets specifically for security or in hiring potentially, or things are as normal?
Yeah, I don't know that I've seen a lot of change yet, and I don't know. I think COVID awakened some folks to the fact that security was bigger than they thought it was. I think COVID actually promoted security to a certain extent. And I think now that we're where we are, where everyone has made it over that hump, gotten their bandwidth, gotten their concentrators, everyone's working from home and everyone's humming along business as usual, except now everyone's at home. We're seeing an uptick in things like fake COVID-19 emails from the World Health Organization. It's actually a phishing attack. Or now that you're working from home, we need you to re-enter your password into our system, and that's fake. And so we're seeing more COVID-related attacks out there. And again, I think there's a corresponding uptick in security awareness. So the trend I've been seeing is that, we're definitely seeing an economic hit by COVID, right? There's no getting away from that. If you work in retail, if you work in the restaurant business, bars, whatever, all over the world, we're seeing businesses closing and failing utterly and people losing their jobs. And there's all kinds of horrible stories out there. But in the corporate environments, I'm seeing that there's actually more attention being paid to security. And I don't know that that's necessarily more budget, but definitely more attention. And attention usually has some budget with it, right?
Definitely. And in terms of business continuity, obviously, as you mentioned, there were things that were completely outside of the quote unquote planned phase. So I'm not surprised that they all of a sudden had to to scramble to address these additional requirements. So from your perspective, I noticed that you published some articles specifically around ways to measure risk, right? Mm-hmm. So you have your commitment to your leadership, and I'm assuming to your customers as well right now, to speak in terms of business terms and how you weight the kind of the security risk against those. Yep. Maybe you can expand and maybe kind of explain what that means to you, and how do you practice that in your current role.
So my little mantra is business first, risk second, security third. Most of us as security leaders tend to think of our tech stack first and bring that forward. We need money. Why do we need money? Because we need more firewalls. Why do we need more firewalls? Because, and we start answering the why. You should lead with the why. You don't walk in and say, I need money because I need firewalls, or I need money because I need DLP, or I need money because I need CASB. No. You walk in and you say, business, let's sit down together and talk about what we, the business, collectively think the priorities are. That's step one, right? Let's sit down as a collective. I want somebody from HR, somebody from legal, somebody from finance, and somebody from accounts payable and accounts receivable, and engineering and marketing and sales. And let's all sit down together and say, what are the most important things we as a business do, and what are the most important things we as a business have? And let's agree to that first. Start with that conversation. And what should come out of that conversation is something along the lines of everybody collectively realized, like, gee, email kind of matters. If email goes down, everybody's business grinds to a halt. That's bad. We want email to be on the top 3 list of things we care about. And then maybe depending on the kind of business you are, let's say you have a call center. The call center guys are going to say that phones are pretty daggone important. Maybe you have an entire sales team that also uses the phones. They're going to say that's important. So maybe that makes the list. Engineering is going to say protecting our source code is important. And everyone's got their list they put forward. So as a collective business, again, you start comparing these things, and you also start asking yourselves hard questions like, what happens if it goes down? What do we have in place today to deal with that? I worked at one company years ago where everybody at the business table for round one said, for example, payroll. Payroll matters a lot, right? Yeah, that's an important business process. Let's get that on the list. And then when it came time to actually talk about, let's fine tune the list and start talking about where we're going to spend money and where we're not going to spend money this year, the payroll guys quietly peeped up and said, if it all crashes, we've actually set ourselves up for manual backup, and we can cut the checks and have them out with only 1 day of delay. And everyone was like, what? Yeah, we can completely revert to people signing physical checks, crank them out, and get them out the door in a day. Oh, let's take that one off the list then. It sounds like we already have our backup for that. It's not ideal. It's not optimal, but if the phones go down, there's no manual backup. If the email goes down, there's no manual backup. And so these are business conversations about what matters. And once you've agreed to what matters, you then, as the CISO, need to start sort of coaching them on risk. So now we determine email is what matters most. Okay, let's talk about what can take down email. Is it an on-prem email server? Is it in the cloud? Okay, whose cloud is it? All right, what kinds of interfaces does it support? What kind of APIs are open and exposed? And start having the conversation about what could happen to your email server. What can take down an email server? What bad things could happen? Well, it's only in the one data center. So if we have a flood or a tornado or a fire, we have no email at all. Yeah, okay, ooh, that's bad. And start walking them through the types of things that can derail or disrupt those priorities that we all collectively as the business agreed to. Start coaching them on risks. And now is time for the final conversation, which is, okay, let's talk about the degree we want to mediate that risk and how much money we're willing to spend. And that conversation historically has been done by feeding them all kinds of metrics, feeding them all kinds of budget proposals. They don't like it. You go back to your desk, you crank more numbers, call more vendors, come up with other proposals, come back and say, well, okay, I wanted 100K. You guys said 50K. For 50K, I can probably get you this and no more. And these kinds of conversations took weeks sometimes, because every time the numbers slid, you were back to ground one of calling vendors and looking at solutions and all this, right? There's a new thing out there called security performance management. And full disclosure, I am now on the board of advisors for a company called TrustMap. I used them in my last role, loved them so much, I actually called them and said, I want to be on your board of advisors. And they are a security performance management company. It is now possible to have that conversation in nearly real time, where you are looking at maturity scores, you were looking at framework compliance, you were looking at cataloging and outlining actual true business risk, and you're having dollar conversations and sliding the bars around and saying, to go from a maturity curve of, currently we're at 2.0, we want to go all the way to 5.0, it's going to cost us roughly $250,000. If we go to 3.0 this year and stop there, it's only going to cost us $100,000. And you can have these conversations sort of dynamically in real time. And security performance management, I'm a huge fan of. Like I said, I joined their advisory board specifically because of how much I loved it.
So I'm sure the business leaders really it really resonates with them that you mentioned it, business first, right?
Yep.
The fact that you embrace that and say, okay, how can I get the security I guess intertwined with your business processes, and as you mentioned, security controls that are not in line with the business can be bypassed, right? And we know this, right? If everyone, if it's a long password, they take a sticky note and put it on the screen and the monitor. So, hey, what's the point of a long password? You also recommend that organizations own security, right?
Yep.
What do you mean by that? And own is in quotation marks.
Yeah. So back to those first two phases. You've gathered the business. You've gotten the business to say, here's what we collectively have agreed is important. You then, as the CISO, coach them on the risks. But at the end of the day, you explain to them, the stakeholders and the owners of these business processes and these business assets, you guys ultimately own this. I'm here to coach you and guide you. I'm here to point out these bad 8 things could happen. I'm here to tell you that to fix all 8 is going to cost you X, to fix 4 of the 8 is going to cost you Y, to fix 2 of the 8 is going to cost you Z. But at the end of the day, it's your call, it's your asset, it's your process, it's not mine. If you come to me and say, you know what, we don't feel like spending any money on it whatsoever, I know we've had the conversation, you know we've had the conversation. If the bad thing happens and everything blows up, that's on you, right? And if you decide that you're only willing to spend 50K instead of 100K, or you want to spend the whole 100K, whatever it is, it's a business conversation, and it's all about whoever owns the asset, whoever owns the process is ultimately and should be the one making the call. you shouldn't, as the CISO, be running around telling people spend the 100K because you need to solve these 3 risks. No, 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 no. Here's what the risks are. Here's what the costs are. You own it. You tell me, man, and I'll go implement and do whatever. I don't care. I don't have a dog in this hunt, as we say in Texas.
And that's traditionally, it's not, it's not like that, right? Most organizations think, okay, the CISO is responsible for everything, right? And then you get to blame for any incidents and so on. That's why the longevity, I think, for CISOs are not that long, right? Depending on their the tenure. See, somebody asked a question here. Do you require the owner to sign risk acknowledgement?
Yeah, risk acceptance letters. I have used risk acceptance letters in certain times and places in my career. I consider them to be a very amateur tool in the context of what we just discussed. In other words, if you're doing your job as a CISO and you've gained the traction you're supposed to gain, and you've integrated yourself with the business to the degree I described, then a risk acceptance letter isn't required at all. You've already got that mutual understanding. It's on the table. The collective security council you've formed, everyone understands that the business, not you, have collectively made the decisions of priority, that the business, not you, have collectively made the decisions of costing and funding and risk appetite, and you're just there to coach and guide. If you have that traction, you don't need risk acceptance letters. Now, getting that traction is the challenge. I have been a CISO in shops where I never could get that traction. I just flat out couldn't get there. I've been a CISO in shops where within 6 months I had that humming and happening. So a lot of it is on you as the CISO. A lot of it is on the business and how receptive they are. And this ties into one of my other big pieces of guidance, which is if you're going to be a CISO someplace, it's more important, I think, for a CISO than almost any other job out there to interview the interviewers, to be grilling them as much as they're grilling you. Because to David's point, it will indeed happen that the blame gets thrown your way. It will indeed happen that the naive assumption that somehow you magically own and can fix everything, and if you didn't, you get fired. Those beliefs are out there. That whole ecosystem certainly still exists. And part of what you're doing as you consider taking on a CISO gig is you're gauging the business's ability and appetite to understand that's actually not the real model, and that they do in fact have a critical role of ownership in all of this. And that's part of the job interview process, is making sure that they're going to work with you, right? If you don't get good warm fuzzies from that particular quadrant, don't take the job.
Yeah, well, if you get a feeling they're looking to have, get somebody to hang at one point, like they do in Texas, right? Then you have a problem. So from your perspective, and obviously you have such a wide view of things, what excites you in the industry right now, like in terms of maybe people, technologies, companies, and then the inverse of that, you look at something and you say, wow, this is really annoying, like it really upsets me.
Right.
So what excites you, what upsets you from
I think
perspective?
In terms of the tech stack right now today, what excites me is a combination of SASE and identity and access management coupled with EDR, sort of solving the entire endpoint and perimeter security problem. Couple that with some next gen AV, some application aware firewalls, not AV. We already covered the EDR, and you've pretty well got a lock, right? Add some email protections and you're home free. So that's the modern world to me, and it starts with that EDR, SASE, IDAM, identity and access management play. And to me, there's a lot of folks that aren't there yet, that are still stuck in what I consider to be old and boring tech. And it's scary because at this point in time, CASB, DLP, which are relatively new technologies, with new companies still emerging, creating these solutions, and relatively new companies that we look at and think of as, oh yeah, those are new players on the block. I'm already considering traditional CASB and DLP to be old hat. I'm looking more and more at identity and access management as the core, and things like SASE and EDR complementing and solving a lot of these problems. Now, SASE obviously incorporates CASB, just like UEBA once upon a time stood on its own, and now it's gone because it all got bought up by SIM vendors, right? I think CASB is going to get absorbed and get integrated into larger paradigms like SASE. I think that's a trend that's probably coming. DLP, traditional regex-based DLP, is so boring to me and so frustrating. Not a big fan. So that's kind of what I'm into and not into in terms of the tech stack. In terms of the people and the shops and the companies, it's really, it ties back into what I was talking about when I talked about interviewing. Cutting edge companies for security are not necessarily companies that have a cutting edge technology stack. A cutting edge security company to me is a company who has embraced security, has got a CISO, has got an executive role for security, has given that executive role a seat at the big kids table. It's not just a relegated off to the side, yeah, you get a C title, but you're really stuck over here in the corner, and has embraced that ownership paradigm we talked about. I want to see a company having those three hallmarks. And if those three hallmarks are met, what you will find is that security budgets are aligned with risk and not just with what the CISO is asking for in terms of tech stack. And that's another sign of a healthy and good organization from a security perspective. If every dollar can point specifically to a key risk and that risk is measured and known as it stands today, and that its outcome risk is also measured and understood. If every dollar is flowing according to that paradigm, that's a good cutting edge security conscious company in my book. That's where you want to get to. The blinky lights follow. That's what should be leading. And that also brings up the whole paradigm of GRC and its role, right? And I happen to own the GRC team in my organization. I've owned GRC teams in the past. I've worked parallel to them in the past. I've owned them in the past. I've had every relationship you can have with GRC. I think we have a collective failing as an industry when it comes to GRC. And what I mean by that is we tend to be compliance driven. We put the C first, and that's what always kicks it off and starts it. And then we do the G, and then we do the R. And so it's really CGR is kind of the order of operation that we tend to do it in. And what that ends up resulting in, even if it's all for valid business reasons, I mean, let's say you work in a heavily regulated, like healthcare, finance, government, whatever, defense, you're in a heavily regulated environment. You better have some C. You've got to have the C. You've got to have the compliance piece there. But that doesn't mean that it should shape and guide and dictate. In other words, people fall into the trap of compliance says I must have a policy for passwords. Therefore, I've written a password policy. Now I have a password policy. Now the compliance auditors come around. Now I can show them the policy. Now they can check the box. The policy goes back on the shelf, and not at any point in that entire conversation did anybody actually mention that policy being real. Did anybody mention that policy being meaningful? Did anyone mention that policy being actionable? And did anyone mention the user community having any clue that it existed? Right? That's the problem with leading with C. So you have to get to a point with your policy stack that, yes, indeed, you're still meeting the compliance requirements, but you are also actually aligned with the realities of your shop. And the dream state is that policy is actually doing what policy all along was intended to do, which is actually shaping and steering and guiding the practices of the shop. So if you start with that business risk, security paradigm, business first, then risk, then security, and you lead with the R in your GRC, right? Now you're aligned with the big picture. And then the most important thing becomes the governance. Risk is now understood. You've already done that sort of outside of your GRC process. So really what you're saying is for the GRC process, you're starting with governance. You want to get yourself to a point where your policy documents are short, sweet, and speak to the reality at hand. If you have a password policy that says all passwords must be changed X time period and everyone must be these complex characters, it must include at least 2 uppercase, 2 lowercase, 2 alpha, 2 numeric, blah, 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 blah. You're going to roll that policy out and pat yourself on the back and check your compliance box. And then you're going to have your entire IT team come back and say, well, this firewall over here can't do that. This appliance over here can't do that. These guys over here, yes, I can change them and I can support the complexity you want, but I literally have to manually change it for these 150, and you're asking me to do that once a month. That's 2 days out of the month, one full-time person doing nothing but changing passwords every month. Like, you start to hit the realities of your shop. So you should not ignore those realities and keep the policy as it is. You should change the policy. The policy should literally state, in all cases where applicable, in all cases where possible with less than X effort, you should start to make the policy as real to the reality of your shop as possible and get it to a point where when you hand that policy to anybody in your organization, they can actually follow it, they can actually obey it, they can actually fulfill it, And now what you've got is a policy people look at, care about, talk to, point to, and when you're all said and done, is actually driving your shop. This is GRC actually doing what GRC was intended to do all along, and that frankly GRC doesn't do anywhere, right? That's the dream goal. Because now you can lay a procedure doc on top of that and use your procedure docs to sort of poke the shop and start pushing them a little more forward. We're going to phase out those crappy appliances that don't support complex passwords. And so now we have a procedure doc that says if you're on this kind of policy, on this kind of platform, you've got X days or X months to transition to this and that and the other. And you start to push the shop. You start to guide and steer the security practices through your policy and procedure documents. And now you've actually done what GRC claims to do.
I think this would resonate with a lot of people that have struggled, GRC specifically, through the years. We're kind of running out of time here. So why don't we end up in a, positive note? Since COVID-19 hit back in March, maybe there's, things that are, developed to be positive for you and potentially your family and your business and so on. Maybe something you can share with us.
Let's see here. The work from home shift. I was already working from home on a semi-regular basis here and there, and obviously it's now permanent and has been for months now. I'm finding that I'm actually much more productive working from home than I was working at the office, and I think the reasons are twofold. One is the lack of commute means that I'm on the keyboard earlier. And the other is because the keyboard is always there, even at night. Like I'm talking to you guys on my main personal computer, and right here to my right is my work computer. And all throughout the night, if I'm watching Netflix or something, I might turn and check an email, And so I find myself putting in more work hours, but in a way that isn't, it doesn't feel like I'm doing more work. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think it's been a positive change. And I think a lot of companies are realizing that. A lot of companies were fearing work from home. And I think a lot of the ones who used to fear it are now embracing it and realizing it actually can cause productivity to increase, not decrease. And I think that's kind of exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, a lot of folks can relate to this. The only caveat to that is that you don't stop working, right? There's
right.
there's almost no delineation between the work and your personal life.
You have to hold firm and create that work-life balance boundary. My wife is always saying, set boundaries, as I'm checking my work email on the phone.
So that's the key takeaway, I think, for this conversation as well. So you already mentioned that you can be reached via LinkedIn, which is obviously the preferred method.
Yep.
You also have a website where you post, it's allanalford.com, right?
Yep.
Where you post some of your work, and
I've got resources and things up there, all kinds of presentations and different resources that are available to the community. Business Impact Light Calculator, 4-year roadmap, mapping NIST and ISO, and all kinds of goodness.
That's awesome. So thank you very much for taking part, and thank you for the contribution to the community. Much appreciated. And I hope that post maybe things would come back to normal, where we maybe can meet one of the physical events in New York City once post these times, and
right.
looking and maybe grab a beer and talk shop and talk maybe about your next video game purchase.
Sounds good, man. I'd love to get up there.
Thank you very much, Allan. Thank you all for taking part today. Appreciate it.
Take care, guys.
Take care. Thank you again.